In 1948, the U.S. interfered in Italy's elections. These were the first elections there since the war. The CIA basically created a new party called Democrazia Cristiana Italiana, threw a bunch of money at it, and smeared the socialists and communists to tilt the election. Throughout the Cold War, the U.S. kept meddling in Italy, but the election interference in 1948 was a pretty obvious violation of the UN's ban on the use of force. Then came Korea. In 1950, the U.S. started bombing there, leading to the Korean War, which was devastating for the people on the ground. Folks in Europe and the U.S. tend not to remember it as much now, but Koreans definitely do. That war split the country into North and South and caused massive destruction. In 1953, the U.S. overthrew the government in Iran, which is obviously illegal. You can't just walk in and topple someone else's government. Once again, the CIA carried out the operation. They went after Prime Minister Mossadegh, who'd been democratically elected, but he wanted to nationalize Iranian oil. The Brits and Americans really didn't want that, so they took him out. That's another huge violation of the UN's rules on using force. Then we've got Guatemala. In 1954, the U.S. intervened there too and toppled President Arbenz, who'd been elected. He'd introduced land reforms to help poor people, but major U.S. corporations like the United Fruit Company weren't having it. CIA Director Allen Dulles was the one who made it happen. He was ruthless. And because the U.S. holds veto power in the UN Security Council, there was no condemnation. Let's be real. If Guatemala had attacked the U.S. in 1954, it would have been slapped with a UN condemnation in a heartbeat. Next on the list is the Congo. In 1961, the U.S. intervened there. Kinshasa is the capital now, and it used to be a Belgian colony for a long time. After Belgium basically exploited the country, it finally became free. Then Patrice Lumumba, a very charismatic leader, came to power through democratic means. But the Americans decided they didn't want Lumumba around, so President Eisenhower actually ordered his assassination from the White House. That's obviously a huge violation of the UN's ban on using force. Robert Johnson, who was in the room at the time, remembered everyone was shocked when Eisenhower, in August 1960, said Lumumba needed to be eliminated. He said there was total silence for about 15 seconds, and then the meeting just kept going. Johnson said he couldn't believe he heard a president openly talk about murder in front of a whole group. He was horrified, and with good reason. Most Americans had no idea their president was authorizing an assassination. Lumumba ended up being killed in 1961. His body was even dissolved in acid. It was a horrific crime. Moving on from the Congo to Cuba, in 1961, the CIA led the Bay of Pigs invasion, an attempt to overthrow Cuba's president, Fidel Castro, and his minister, Che Guevara. Cuba's capital is Havana, located just south of Florida. The CIA landed, but the operation failed, so Castro stayed in power. At that point, the Pentagon asked President Kennedy to send in the Navy and a bigger military force, but Kennedy refused. He also said he wanted to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces, and later, in 1963, Kennedy was assassinated after firing CIA Chief Allen Dulles. Personally, I think the CIA killed him, but that's another story. What matters here is that Castro and Guevara weren't overthrown then. Next up is Vietnam, which the U.S. attacked in 1964, another clear breach of the UN's rules. The Vietnam War was brutal. Vietnam was split at the time, with Hanoi in the north and Saigon in the south. The U.S. backed South Vietnam, but there were massive protests in the States. You might have seen those "Get the hell out of Vietnam" signs during peace rallies in Washington. It's a big reminder that you can't automatically equate a government's actions with its people's opinions. Many Americans were against the war, though some supported it. Then there's Chile. In 1973, the U.S. toppled the government there too, this time under CIA Director Richard Helms. He destabilized Chile, and the elected president, Salvador Allende, was overthrown. After that, General Pinochet took over as a dictator, which brought torture and murder of his political opponents. People in Chile remember Pinochet's reign very vividly, even if many in Europe or the US have kind of forgotten. Again, it all directly clashes with the UN Charter's ban on using force, which makes it pretty depressing that it happened anyway. In 1980, the US overthrew the government in Turkey, something not everyone knows, especially since Turkey is actually part of NATO. And NATO, led by the US, is the world's largest military alliance, calling itself defensive, but often acting offensively. It's got 32 member states now, with Sweden and Finland joining recently. Since Turkey's a NATO member, you wouldn't expect a coup from a supposed ally, but that's exactly what happened. General Kenan Evren led the coup in 1980, and he ended up ruling Turkey as president until 1989. Paul Hens, who was the CIA station chief in Turkey, left the country right before the coup. He supposedly told President Carter in Washington, "Our boys did it." Then there's Nicaragua in 1981. The U.S. attacked from neighboring Honduras by training and arming the so-called Contras through the CIA. These Contras committed horrific crimes in Nicaragua. President Reagan funded them, and they caused a ton of suffering. The International Court of Justice in The Hague condemned the U.S. for waging war in Nicaragua in 1986, but the U.S. ignored it. Basically, Reagan didn't care what the World Court said. Nicaragua had gone to the court, claiming the U.S. was violating the UN's ban on force, and the court agreed, but Washington just brushed it off. The next military action to talk about is the U.S. invasion of Grenada in 1983, a tiny island in the Atlantic north of Venezuela, officially called Operation Urgent Fury. Next is 1986, when the U.S. bombed Libya for the first time. It happened again in 2011. That operation was called Operation El Dorado Canyon. Obviously, it was illegal. If Libya had bombed the US or France in 1986, the Security Council would have condemned it immediately. But since the US sits on the Council, it blocked any condemnation. In 1989, the US invaded Panama and overthrew Noriega, a guy who'd once worked closely with the Americans. They called that invasion Operation Just Cause, which is pretty ironic. There was nothing just about it, but they always come up with some sort of name. Then came the 1991 attack on Iraq, which happened after Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. Saddam Hussein was condemned by the Security Council right away in August 1990 because he didn't have a veto. The US got the green light to push Saddam out of Kuwait, and the Council gave them a resolution allowing it. The US then proceeded to bomb the entire country heavily. That was Operation Desert Storm. Not to be confused with the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which was a whole separate attack. So yes, the US actually bombed Iraq twice. In 1999, there was a major turning point. Germany started taking part in bombing campaigns again after being neutral since the 1950s. President Bill Clinton led the NATO bombing of Serbia, and Germany joined in under Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. After that, Germany also got involved in Afghanistan, Syria, and now Ukraine, mainly through arms deliveries and training soldiers, though no troops on the ground. Basically, the US pulled Germany back into war, and it all started with Serbia in 1999. Serbia isn't in NATO and doesn't want to join. They were actually attacked by NATO at the time. There was no UN Security Council resolution for this, so it was clearly illegal. That's another reason you can say NATO is more of an offensive alliance, not just a defensive one. Next up is Afghanistan in 2001, right after the 9/11 attacks. It's worth noting that the 9/11 attacks, especially the collapse of Building 7, which wasn't hit by a plane, haven't really been honestly investigated. But the US invaded Afghanistan and stayed there for 20 years, bombing the country and killing a lot of people. Some were captured and taken to Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, where they were tortured. A huge scandal that still isn't fully addressed. Under torture, some detainees admitted responsibility for 9/11, but that's obviously not a trustworthy way of finding the truth. It's basically just rewriting history to suit your narrative. Next came the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Saddam Hussein was overthrown and killed. Officially, the public was told it was all about finding WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, and Secretary of State Colin Powell even made that case at the UN Security Council. Later, it turned out to be false. Then, in 2011, the US went after Libya again. Muammar Gaddafi had been bombed in 1986, but in 2011, President Barack Obama launched a much heavier campaign. In 2011, the US tried to overthrow President Assad. They began bombing Syria in 2014, but it's clear they'd already been involved covertly since 2011. The next crisis, which still affects us today, is the 2014 coup in Ukraine. In February 2014, the US helped topple the government in Kyiv. US Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland was caught on tape telling Ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt, "I don't think Klitschko should be in the new government. I think Yatsenyuk is the guy. And f the EU." It was a big scandal, mostly because of her dismissive attitude toward Europe. My view is that the coup in Ukraine was illegal. President Yanukovych was ousted, leading to 8 years of civil war, and then Russia's invasion in 2022, which was also illegal. But the conflict really goes back to 2008, when the US announced it wanted Ukraine to join NATO, and then in 2014, when Yanukovych refused, they overthrew him. Things got more sensitive when the Nordstream pipelines were blown up. I see it as an attack on Germany, basically cutting off its energy supply. This happened on September 26, 2022, and people asked, did the US blow up Nord Stream? I personally think so. Journalist Seymour Hersh claims President Joe Biden and CIA Director Bill Burns authorized the operation. Hersh says some inside the CIA were worried because if that sabotage was traced back to the US, it would be an act of war. And I agree. It's definitely an act of war against Germany. There's another version of the story that surfaced in August 2024, saying it wasn't the CIA at all, but some Ukrainian operatives, and that Zelensky supposedly knew about it, while the CIA tried but failed to stop them. The Wall Street Journal ran that story, claiming 6 Ukrainians left the German port of Rostock on a yacht called Andromeda and blew up the pipelines, with Zelensky in the loop and the CIA raising concerns too late. Personally, I doubt that's how it happened. Moving on to the Middle East, everyone's been shaken by the ongoing war between Israel and Palestine. On January 12th, under President Biden's orders, the US and Britain bombed Yemen. That's illegal under the UN's ban on using force, and the Houthis said they'd retaliate by attacking ships in the Red Sea. Russia called for an emergency meeting at the UN Security Council, but it didn't help. So now Yemen has been bombed too. It's a long list of conflicts where countries have been bombed or experienced coups. Since 1945, the US has bombed or toppled more governments than anyone else. Right now, it's unclear how this will all play out in the 21st century. Maybe the US will eventually back off if it faces pushback from rising powers like the BRICS countries or from its own citizens, who might become more critical of these endless wars. Anyway, thanks for listening.